Good afternoon and welcome to this University of Maryland College of Information Studies panel discussion. My name is Keith Marzullo and I'm the Dean of this college. Today we're going to hear a discussion about confidence in institutions. Please note that this presentation is being recorded. Edelman is a global communications firm that partners with businesses and organizations to evolve, promote, and protect their brands and reputations. As part of their mission, they survey the levels of public trust in four kinds of institutions: government, business, media, and NGOs around the world. In their spring update, which they just released, they noted that during this time of the COVID pandemic, worldwide trust has gone up in all four kinds of institutions, and government has become the most trusted of the four. They saw trust in government rise the most in the UK, Canada, and Germany, and next to the least in the United States. Japan actually saw a decrease in trust in their government. The US results are, of course, polarized by political party. Both showed high levels of trust in local government, but Republicans trust business and Democrats trust media and NGOs. Edelman also warns that this may be a trust bubble. I suspect they're right. So welcome to this era of mistrust. It gives me great pleasure to introduce the moderator for today's panel, Dr. Jennifer Goldbeck. Jen is a professor in the College of Information Studies, as well as an affiliate in the Department of Computer Science and the Philip Merrill College of Journalism. Dr. Goldbeck, is an expert in social networks, social media, privacy, and security on the web. Take it away, Jen.
Thanks, Keith. So thanks everyone for joining us today. I'm going to be moderating the panel. The way that we plan for this to run today is that first I'm going to have each of the panelists very briefly introduce themselves. Then we're going to give them each a few minutes to talk through their own perspective on this kind of issue and how they see things facing us, particularly with an emphasis on the impact that COVID-19 has had on our trust in institutions and seeing it declining, especially among a lot of groups, as Keith laid out. Who do we turn to when we can't rely on the groups that we normally would, or how do we elevate different groups in those spaces? Once everyone has had a chance to give us their deeper thoughts on that topic, we're going to go to Q&A. I will have some questions myself that I'm going to pull together as we're talking, but you are also welcome to join us with Q&A. So I'm going to reach up here and touch the screen. You should have a Q&A option. It's not chat. There's a separate Q&A option. And in there, you can type in your questions. Those will appear for me. And so I may incorporate your questions as I'm going through and posing my own questions to the panel. When I've gone through all of mine and any of mine that I feel kind of tie in with the ones you've suggested, I'll turn to the questions that you've provided in the Q&A. So we're going to go for about an hour, and hopefully you'll come away a little optimistic with thoughts about what we can do to find places and sources of information that we can trust in this space, and just having a better understanding of where everything stands at this point. So with that as an introduction, I'd first like to ask our panelists to each introduce themselves. Ron, Michael, and then Nicole, if you don't mind, just a brief introduction.
I'm Ron Yarrows from the Philip Merrill College of Journalism and an affiliate now of the iSchool. I'm honored to be so. And I basically research how users seek, select, and share digital information.
Thanks. Michael?
Hi, I'm Mike Hammer. I'm a professor in the Department of Government and Politics. I'm also the research director for the Center for Democracy and Civic Engagement. And a big part of what I do there is co-direct with colleagues at the Washington Post, University of Maryland poll. I study voting and public opinion in the United States, and I'm increasingly interested in the issues we're talking about today, particularly how government can communicate to citizens to provide more information about the processes and policies and to build trust and confidence.
Thanks, Mike.
Thank you.
And Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nicole Turner-Lee. I'm a senior fellow and the director of the Center for Technology Innovation at the Brookings Institution, which is a global think tank here in Washington, D.C. I'm also adjunct lecturer at iSchool at the University of Maryland. My focus is on technology and the intersection of technology, social justice, and race. And I'm particularly interested in issues related to not just digital communications, but the extent to which citizens even have access to the new public square that is defined and empowered through online connectivity. So just a shameless plug, I'm also working on a book on this that will come out in 2021 through Brookings Press on the U.S. digital divide and how it affects a lot of what we're going to talk about today.
That's awesome. Thanks and congrats on the forthcoming book. Good. So with those introductions, we're going to do the same order, and everyone's going to give us a little deeper dive into like their research, how it connects to these issues, again, in the same order. So Ron, if you want to start.
All right. Thank you very much, Jen, and good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining this. I wanted to basically keep myself on task here by making sure that my slides will keep me within a 7 or 8 minute time frame. But as I mentioned, I'm interested in users, and I guess that really means audience engagement and analytics to you. I wanted to start off with analytics just to show that according to Chartbeat, which has hundreds of news organization clients around the world, here is the trend of the number of COVID-19 articles per day. So you can see the rapid increase after about March 9th. And accordingly, with the number of articles, this is the Chartbeat data showing engagement with news, other news in blue, and COVID-19 news in the orange. So it's significantly more, again, beginning in mid-March. Now, my research has been 6 national surveys so far. We have 1 more to go. That'll be this Friday, and that'll be interesting to see because it's been 30 days since the data you're about to see was collected. We looked at 4,400 people approximately, and we measured several things, but the trust was included. And I want to mention that the trust in government was measured before and after a very brief CDC statement. We wanted to expose the participants to a statement on that day, and the survey was administered for only 1 day. So they presumably were getting some additional information. Okay, what did we find? First of all, the CDC's work on a scale of 1 to 5, and the respect and trust for CDC was much higher than the other categories you're about to see. Officials care about us during this process. There is the ranking before and after the CDC statements. You say, well, that's not that much, and what about the other ones? And the key is that there is a trend. After reading the latest information from the CDC, trust in government agencies increased. White House competence increased, although as you can see, it's the lowest of the 3. And we also measured worry. How worried are you about contracting the disease? And according to a theoretical model out of communication, the worry or emotional response should decrease as trust increases. So here, I think it does demonstrate across the board, across many categories, that we're seeing that. Also, we looked at how people process this COVID information by their primary source of information. They had to indicate what did they turn to for most of their information. Very interesting. How worried are they? Well, television viewers are far more worried than the web users. Television users really think the officials care much more than web users. Trust in agencies, again, television users. The CDC job, now that may be related, of course, to the television broadcasts and the briefings that we received up to about 30 days ago. But you can see consistently that the web produced far lower ratings. And interestingly, television and social media as being the primary source were relatively close. White House competent in holding this, in handling this crisis, there it is. So once again, the web. Why would the web be so much lower? I'd be interested in knowing from the panelists and perhaps your theories. My thought is that, according again to the Chartbeat data, searching and personalized information and looking for something very specific, in this case, as you can see, definitely outpaced even Facebook page views. So probably, one could argue that searching for specific information is going to lead you to much more of a diverse opinion than just watching one television network. Now, finally, in terms of this survey, I wanted to show you that the worry in the past 90 days by political party indicates, interestingly, that really, I mean, Democrats and Republicans are equally worried. You can see the June rating there on a scale of 1 to 5 that they're going to contract the disease. But as you would expect, when we talk about trust in government, we still have a little bit more of a discrepancy between the Republicans having more trust than the Democrats. And finally, now I'm going to ask you to complete a poll. And I'm going to do it in the context of trust with news media. And so if our, yeah, there we go. I just want to know, please indicate if you were born before 1980 or 1980 or later. And we'll give that about 10 more seconds before we go. I do want to say that I think that the trust in media has, obviously been decreasing since about 1980 when CNN came on board. And arguably, it really took a nosedive in the 2016 presidential election when fake news became a much more popular term. Okay, so let's see what the results were in terms of our, okay, so we have 50, hey, this is cool, 51% before 80, 49% after. Okay, so why would we want to know that? Before 1980, you probably can recall that we had 3 dominant 30-minute fact-only newscasts every evening. Now, admittedly, we needed more diversity here in the anchors, but the point is we only had 30-minute newscasts. In fact, if I were to ask you who was the most trusted man in America, if you gave that some thought before 1980, you probably would know it was Walter Cronkite. So here we have a journalist who is the most trusted man in America. Now, after 1980, yes, we still have the 30-minute newscasts. They are far lower in the ratings. And of course, as you might expect, it's because of the competition from the networks and also social media. And I'm actually imposing now over the logos how they rank in the world as far as viewership. So BBC #1, Fox, CNN, both in the top 5. And with all of that now on board, we have a lot more faces to look at. Now, no personal comment about each individual here. I'm sure they are all respected by their audiences. But the point is, these are not people who host 30-minute fact-only evening newscasts. They, of course, are producing their own opinions. This today on Fox News, which is the fact that Hannity on Fox News's homepage is arguing about Trump tariffs. This on the CNN homepage right now, Trump refuses to break his deafening silence, not just silence, and that the president appears to have made. Well, those are judgments. They're not facts. We don't have a quote. And that just talks about, analysis and politics that are now infiltrating into what used to be factual news. So in conclusion, I see the erosion of trust in news media began with the transformation from facts only to 24/7 news information combined with partisanships and analyses. And I'm starting a study now that will do exactly what I just did, poll the audience based on their age and to see whether or not that has contributed to the rapid erosion in trust. Secondly, web users rank trust in government significantly lower than users of TV and social media. We don't know exactly why, but we can talk about it. And finally, the CDC is rated higher in public trust than the White House. So let's hope that will translate to a little bit more briefings now from the CDC. So if you have any information that you would want to share with me or questions, my website is mediaengagement.org and my email is ryaros@umd.edu. So thank you very much for that. Back to you,
Thanks
Jan.
very much. Thanks, Ron. Michael, you're up next.
Great, thank you. So I don't have the fancy slides that Ron had. That was really great, Ron. Thank you. I learned a lot. So from the perspective of political science, we've been studying trust for a long time, and I think that the general consensus, and it's rare to find consensus among political scientists, but this is one place where we do see it, is that trust in government and most of our institutions, save the military really is one that endures with getting a lot of trust across time, has been disturbingly low for decades. During the COVID-19 pandemic, I think we've seen that governors have become much more prominent, and especially early on, many saw very strong support. We also saw, support for Donald Trump generally trailed that of governors and also government employed scientists, which is very, very interesting. the pandemic, as we know, affects everyone. And I think what that has done is it has made people pay attention. We struggle in political science to try to understand people's attention to politics and the media, and often from the perspective of concern that people aren't paying enough attention. Well, I think we've seen a massive shift in that. People are really tuning in and trying to get information. Obviously, as Ron showed, the source matters, and people are getting it from many different sources. And so that opens up new questions. But one of the things that I think we've seen is that for the most part, people are willing to listen to scientists and take their advice to heart. In some of the polls that we've done with the Washington Post, we've seen large majorities support policies relating to wearing masks, staying away from other people at least 6 feet, and avoiding large gatherings. We've also seen strong support for policies that restrict businesses, restaurants, and other things. But a lot of what we see in news coverage are smaller, very intense groups who are, concerned about the restrictions on their freedom, especially in the early times. But, one of the things that was really interesting to me was, across some of the early stages of the process of polling, we saw these protests about the restrictions emerge in some places, including in Annapolis, but that really was not in line with what we were seeing in public opinion polls. Most people were on board with these restrictions. Now, of course, partisanship still plays a huge role, and that's a really defining feature of American politics today. People use partisanship when they evaluate politicians, policy, and institutions, but I think we do see, when we compare across different types of government leaders and institutions, that people are willing to tune in and pay attention to who's trying to do a good job and who's actually succeeding in doing a good job, and who isn't. One of the really interesting things is, as I've come into this research largely from a background in an election reform and voting, you see that there really isn't a lot of research in American politics on government responsiveness. And I think one of the things that we need to pay more attention to and to try to study more is, what sorts of information can government, and particularly our governmental institutions, provide to the public to try to build trust? And then what are the best ways to try to communicate that? I think those are some of the more interesting questions going forward that we need to try to figure out. I also think it's important to think about how the COVID-19 pandemic and the killing of George Floyd and the aftermath of that have interacted. I mean, that's really posed a huge test for all of us, including our governmental institutions. And we have a really highly decentralized system of governance in the United States. States and local governments have huge authority over lots of different really important things. And I think two of the things that come very quickly to mind in this context are policing. As we see, much of that is very much determined at a very localized level. And elections. We have thousands of elections officials in this country, and the rules for each individual vary. And we're going to see a lot of those responses across states and across local communities shaping how the public feels about trust. And I think that's where we need to start looking in terms of more research in this area. And I think people, I'm at least somewhat optimistic, going to some of the earlier themes that Keith and Jen noted, that people are paying attention. They're going to be able to figure out who is and who isn't providing a good faith effort to try to deal with these issues, to bring about policies that promote health, safety, and racial and social justice. So with that, I'm interested in any questions that you have later on.
Thanks very much, Mike. And I noticed we had one question come in, which I'm going to save till we go around. But if there are questions that are popping up in your minds in the audience, as any of our speakers are talking. Go ahead and submit those, and I'll make sure to ask them as we go around. Great. So Nicole, your turn.
Yeah, I'm going to try to stay brief so we get to some of those questions. And Jen, you can actually ask questions as well. So I found it interesting from Ron and Michael, just sort of how they've looked at this issue of trust, particularly the agency of trust in government, media, as well as other entities that sort of define, I think, the democratic experience. I mean, what I want to insert into this conversation is the fact that when you start to overlay demographic attributes when it comes to race or age or education, etc., trust declines, and that's not something that's new to this debate. A lot of that is also compounded by the fact that the sources that people go to for trustworthy, for example, news, no longer represent the diversity of the media, whether it's local media, local newspapers, all the way to the diversity of the people that actually deliver the news. I was very intrigued by Ron's slide in terms of who's actually the storyteller, right? And I think that has a lot to do with trust in any of these institutions at the level of where people feel that they're getting authentic, valuable, and useful information. And I think as we look at trust today, as both of my esteemed colleagues have suggested, we cannot divorce trust from two major pandemics that are actually happening right now in society. The pandemic that is a public health concern of COVID-19 and a pandemic of racism. And I think what we're actually seeing today, and this is sort of where I want to add into, because I'm not a pollster on this particular issue, but I do speak a lot about technology. Prior to COVID, we were already dealing with, and I think both of my colleagues have suggested, a polarized society that was sort of amplified by social media networks and where people were either getting their news or who they were deciding to associate with. So about a year or so ago, a colleague of mine, and Jen, you'd like this, it was a graduate student who does community network analysis. We basically looked at where people were sort of congregating on the web and around particular issues. And what we found out was that there is no broker between a Democrat and Republican, between an affinity group that, is against or supports Black Lives Matter or affinity group that supports white supremacists. And so if you combine to this conversation of trust, which is what I work on in technology, what we consider algorithmic amplification and digital polarization that is actually occurring as these platforms become the trusted sources, even when they're misaligned with what the truth is, right? You're actually seeing how trust is really deteriorating across government. And I bring that up because I think Michael actually gave a really good point in terms of people now looking to state and local legislators for information. And you could see that actually happening in the COVID response, right? Some people, based on the partisanship, are looking to their governors and looking to their local and elected officials to help them navigate through the pandemic, which I think is really interesting, right? Because we have never seen in terms of trust in agency of government, this type of, leaning towards our local officials in the way that we have now. And of course, that's a whole other conversation on why that also may be the case. But I think it speaks volumes to where people are finding that trust. The second thing I would just like to say as I close up, I think as we have this conversation, I want to go back to what Michael talked about, though, where we're seeing trust actually deteriorate in particular institutions. So as we see in various studies, trust overall has been pretty much around the 40 to 50% line. I think for people of color and other demographic attributes, it goes down, below 40% when we start looking at trusted institutions. But what's interesting, if you were to poll people now, and you look at what has happened with police brutality and what you're seeing in terms of unraveling the envelope around voter suppression, and you're starting to see how individuals are responding to whether it's social media or it's sort of the conglomerate now of media outlets as opposed to local outlets that are sort of sharing the narratives by partisanship, I would be curious to see what trust looks like. Because I think this conversation that we're having today on systemic inequality has a lot to do with where people have found themselves within the ecology of our democratic process. So going forward, I think it's important, particularly for my colleagues who are direct pollsters, to sort of combine this conversation of trust with the democratization of the distribution of information, right? And the extent to which people feel that they are either represented or part of the dialogue in different ways, given the fact that, we're under direct attack due to what some perceive. And again, I think the Edelman study came out prior to the pandemic. I'm curious about post George Floyd, right? What people are thinking. but we're starting to see, I think, a belief by citizens in the abject failure of institutions to keep them safe and, protected in terms of their data, as well as to sort of, even in the handling of the pandemic, ensure that they have the right resources to some of those larger issues that people have been mainly concerned with, like healthcare, et cetera. You see what I mean? So I'd like to end it there for time, Jen, because, you did tell us to keep it kind of short. But, I think that's my contribution as a sociologist who's looking at this from a systemic perspective, where we start to look at trust within this broader context of where we are now.
Thank you. Okay, so now it's my job to ask smart questions based on what all of you had said, and of course, integrating questions that came from the audience. And I'm a little overwhelmed, which is always a good sign because I have so many things that I want to talk about to pull this all together. And Nicole, I think I want to start with you. And for the other panelists, just as we're going through this, I would love everybody to chime in on all of these questions. If you just give me like a little wave that you want to chime in, it'll let me call on you so we don't end up talking over each other. But Nicole, I'm going to start with you on this one. Apologies if I phrase this poorly, because this is a complicated thought in my head, and I didn't plan these questions ahead of time. Okay, so I certainly come from a privileged position as a white woman that for the majority of my life, certainly as a white person, that institutions have been trying to do things to help me, right? So I get sick and I go to the doctor, and I'm very much trust that my doctor is going to do the right thing. The places that I have seen that fail for me personally have intersected with me being a woman, right? When I said I have never wanted kids since I was a little kid, and I go to the doctor when I'm 25 and I'm like, please shut that factory down. And they're like, no, because you might change your mind, right? So this is a intersecting with me being a woman. My doctors, including women, wouldn't give me a procedure that I wanted. But it's like, okay, so I can isolate this corner. Me as a woman am not getting treated well about reproductive things because the system has decided I shouldn't, and that's problematic. But as a white person, the system has always worked well for me. I think we all know pretty well that the system has not worked as well for people of color, and certainly some really explicit cases where Black people were wildly mistreated with incredibly unethical medical experiments by the US government, which puts us in a situation now where very reasonably, as a white person, especially if I had not reflected on these things, I could go, if the doctors say that this is a good thing, that's what I should be doing. If the medical establishment says that this is a good thing, that's what I should be doing. And that there are lots of other communities in this country who don't have that kind of trust for very good reasons. And it gets us in this position now where they're like, is legitimately good science out there about things that we should be doing, and people for also legitimately good reasons questioning if they should follow that and if it actually has their interests in mind. And kind of bringing this back to, some of the things that have come up as all of you were talking, we can look just to the federal government, right, where we've been getting factually incorrect information from Trump regularly, right, contradicted by his own people. There's a story that came out this week that said he had approved the use of faulty antibody tests, right, that are going to make these numbers lower. I think for certainly, my perspective comes up as a white person growing up in rural America, right? And so when I reflect back, I think of myself going back to that town I grew up in. This is the first experience, I am sure, for those people I grew up with in that white town in rural Illinois, where they're going, they gave us tests that were bad and they're trying to suppress these numbers, right? And so, that's not formulated well as a question, but I laid that all out as background because I would love for you to start, and Ron and Mike, certainly for you to chime in after this, talking about this issue of like what these historical experiences that different communities have and how those impact their trust in these institutions. And if you have thoughts, and I don't want to put you on the spot to solve all of our social problems, how do we maybe fix that, right? So we can get legitimate, useful information to these communities in a way.
No, I mean, I think that what you've laid out, Jen, is sort of like the conversation that's happening around people's dinner tables right now, right? In terms of one, assessing in the context of what we're actually experiencing, the extent to which I call it white guilt, where there's a sense of like, what have we done? What is going on here? I'm not comfortable with this. I want to show empathy. But I think the larger question that you're actually bringing out is we've already started with the systems of inequality and systems of oppression. And those systems have pretty much defined, I think, the behavioral as well as the structural foundations in which this country has actually been built upon. And so the larger question becomes, when you look at people of color who by constitutional right were, given the right as a citizen versus property, and you look back, and I think Michael could actually back me up on this, people of color in particular have been very trustworthy in the government, given the fact that the government has been the only way for us to actually, maintain and gain civil rights and civil liberties. But there's an oxymoron here, right? Because the very trust, for example, in the police force, the law enforcement, that people have, that they assume that when you walk through your neighborhood that you will not be seen as a criminal, you will actually be protected from criminals. That same type of inequality has flooded into the very institutions that were designed to create the type of, protections of people of color and other American citizens who are American citizens. So to your question, I think these are real concerns of people. I mean, if you look at the healthcare data in terms of African American trust of medical doctors, it's very limited because we have had experiences like the Tuskegee experiment, where African American men were injected with vaccinations that led to their infertility. We have had cases like Henrietta Lacks, whose DNA was sort of taken from her to help cure cancer, and she was never either compensated or recognized for her contribution. She basically died a poor woman, despite actually having, a major contribution on the remedying or the cure of that particular disease. And so I think when you look at trust in the sense of, and I love your question of how you relate it to the lived and racialized experiences of people who have sat on the wrong side of opportunity and equity and equality, it becomes very problematic, which is why I think media diversity matters, because you need people who can speak to your experience. The reason why a majority of African Americans came out and voted for Barack Obama, because it was the first time that they could have someone at the top helm of government who looked like them. I remember I was in Chicago as a student. There were 85 9-year-old women on the bus talking about, I am waiting for this moment, canes and wheelchairs, in their desire to actually defy the wrongs that people have had placed against them. But I think at the end of the day, even if we have that representation, and I think Ron's work and Michael's work speaks to it, you have to show some consistency, not just around a pandemic, but around voting and other inalienable rights that people have that are not stripped away, or in the case of social media, or in the case of media in general, the stories are not told in ways that are, I want to say, less traumatic. So I'll just end here. Every day as an African-American woman, I look at the news. And I look at the news and I see the trauma that African-Americans have gone through historically. And the other day I said to myself, I have to turn this off because it is mentally draining as a person of color now. It is exhausting to be a person of color now because you're seeing this play in real time, right? It's being recorded, it's being shared. And what's more disheartening is that I have young children who have to replay this again. And I was telling somebody the other day, I wasn't born, I was a little child in 1968 when the protest happened. And I didn't necessarily sit in front of my console TV and watch the dogs and the water hoses be placed on people. But as I look at what's happening now, it's as if our media is sort of fascinated with these incidents and these trauma without an approach that allows us to move past the very causes of what you asked me the other day. Do you think that this police brutality will stop? And I said, no, there will be other George Floyds. That's the reality of the fact that we have a fractured institution of law enforcement. So what I think people should do is what you just did, which is to take the burden of further traumatizing people of color and bring the conversation to the people who run the institutions, who in many respects are responsible for creating this in the first place. Because the oppressed people cannot necessarily change the conscience or the structures which have led to this. And so I kind of stand to that because as a sociologist, we believe race is a social construction. And so it's very hard for a person of color to change the very situation that they already are placed in to make that type of difference, unless you're young people who have decided that you are not leaving cities until election day to actually make some significant change by making people feel uncomfortable. So I don't know if my colleagues want to jump in on that, but that's kind of like how I feel about, how
Thanks,
to
Nicole.
respond to your
Ron, did you
question.
want to chime in? Because Nicole pointed to, some data that you might have a few times in her response there.
Just briefly, I just wanted to mention that what I love about this discussion is that my very specific data really doesn't relate that much to the big picture. And what you are also describing in terms of the valuable big picture is not necessarily represented in the data. So I think it's all a matter of scale, and that while I'm very specific about news, those other issues are paramount, and it merits the good discussion, but it's a different scale.
Mike, just give me a little wave if you want to chime in. Or yeah, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think I learned a lot from Nicole's response and other tremendous questions. And I'm seeing this here. I mean, one of the things that this situation has created is more space for people to have these difficult conversations, and sometimes I'm having these with people in my close immediate family who I think are very like-minded, but sometimes with some extended family too, and seeing those different perspectives, and sometimes seeing where, like, how is that light bulb not going off for some people has been really interesting. But we're in an era where very early on in the Trump presidency, people who had racist views felt empowered to say things out loud that we knew were going on, but they said them out loud, and it's taken a long time for some of that to be combated. And I think the protests that we're seeing now in the wake of the killing of George Floyd are bringing that to the forefront, and creating new conversations that weren't being had in all communities. I mean, I can't speak for every community, but I think across the board we're seeing this, and it's challenging the way we think about things and the way we approach things. And I think that's the path forward, but it's going to be hard. I mean, I'm cautiously optimistic, as I noted earlier, but I think we're fooling ourselves if we think it's going to be easy, because so much happens at that local level that we have massive inequalities in the system that are built into the system, and some of those are really hard to get over, because local decision makers can have so much power, and if you have bad actors in a few places, things can be really awful for the people in that community. So one of the things I think we're starting to see more of, and I'm starting to try to study more, what's happening. This pandemic has created a need for people to cope in all sorts of ways. And one of those things is to try to do something. And I think we're seeing potentially a rise in interest in volunteering and doing more on a community level. And I think that's something that we can study going forward.
Thank you. So Mike, you kind of lead into the next question I have. So someone had sent a question, I think through the chat, to the panelists while one of you was talking. So it kind of flashed up really fast on my screen, and I wrote it down, that said, is more trust in institutions a good thing? I think that's what the question said. So say, there's more trust in the government a good thing? Is more trust in media a good thing? And the gut reaction is like, sure. But like, if they're trustworthy, right? And Nicole, you had made this comment about when these institutions are misaligned with truth, which certainly seems to be the case, like in a lot of ways, right? Of course, at the federal government level at this point, out of the White House, we're seeing everything misaligned with the truth, or an awful lot of it with respect to everything that's going on. But also, even in the media space, I think an interesting thing that we've seen in the course of like the last month with all of the protests has been the media sort of going like, we're quoting what the police have said, because this is what we quote, right? The police said they didn't fire tear gas in Lafayette Square. And then there's all these videos of it happening, right? But the media is just quoting what the police said because that's what they have always done. And that's kind of misaligned with the truth, right? And so I think this is actually a really interesting question to think about. Like, trust is good, like trust is valuable, trust is a commodity, right? There's currency in that. And we want to be able to put that in an institution. So when we're in one of the many crisis situations we're in now, we know who to look to give us reliable, truth-based advice and insight about what's going on. And we're not necessarily seeing that now. But I think the lack of trust that people are having is manifesting in lots of interesting ways, right? Where they're and Ron, I'm going to throw this to you so you can prepare yourself. That there are people now in, say one half of the population who are saying like, yeah, the police are trustworthy, the federal government is trustworthy, this is what I want to see. And there's people going like, wait a second, like either that's not, and we've always known that, or that's not, and I'm just suddenly realizing that it's not. So I don't know how much that plays out in your data, but Ron, you obviously have like a long experience thinking about these kinds of issues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that in general, but also especially with respect to the media.
Well, I did want to respond to your example of the police being quoted versus the video. And in defense of journalism, that's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to present both sides. And thank goodness there was video so that you, the viewer, can look at the truth and see what it is what actually occurred. So in that sense, the police are embarrassed, right? But the journalist, in my view, the job of the journalist is to show both sides. And the problem that we're having in some unnamed networks is that we're getting one side all the time. So, that's just going to feed that particular partisanship or divide. And that was my whole point in my presentation, is we've drifted from the facts to now just, in my opinion, a very confusing message to the audience that opinions are facts, and that every news is fake, in the context of some networks. So that's my response.
Thanks. Nicole, go ahead.
Yeah, can I jump in real quick? Ron, I think what you said is so fascinating, because I think I would take what your argument is just a step further, right? So there's this disconnect in journalism of trying to present both sides, like Jen was talking about. But I think the challenge of the issues that we're seeing currently, and I think some of the issues that we've seen over the last few years, like 2 years ago in Charlottesville, et cetera, is that people are also looking at what we're seeing as a cue for the appropriate carriage of justice, right? And so I think what's also happening is that media is sort of is becoming the arbiter of what's actually the current event. But there are people who have traditionally been sort of marginalized within the media ecosystem that are saying, I have a video with a police officer who's on this man's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And in every case, that's either not admissible or it's not compelling enough to move forward. I think what's so interesting about this period is that media is now being tested, right? In many respects for becoming, the echo chamber for certain populations that have traditionally been sort of marginalized or voiceless when it comes to the carry out of justice. So I love what you say, because I'm like telling people, we have all these videos, but historically these videos have not prosecuted any police officer. So now we're at this, place where people like use this so we can actually.
Mike, you want to chime? Oh, I'm sorry, Ron, go ahead, and then Mike, I'll let you.
Appreciate this because you, like me, appreciate science. The downside of presenting both sides is climate change. Here we have this huge amount of voices saying it's real, and we have maybe a small, if any, scientists saying that it's not something that we should be paying attention to. So in that case, I'm wrong in terms of the balance, because that does not represent the truth, and I don't know how to negotiate that.
True. Yeah, I saw the comment pop up too, and it's a really great question, and I think there's a couple of things I just want to say. Is I agree with Jen's initial point that we want normatively to be able to trust our government and our institutions, but there's a big condition on that, and that is they need to deserve it and they need to earn it. And then what we need to see as indicators, though, that we don't see this very by partisanship. So when a Democrat's in power, the Democrats are trustworthy. When Republicans in power, the Republicans feel the government's trustworthy. We don't want to see this systematically across race and ethnicity and age. I mean, that's the real, I think, test in terms of how we can measure this. And Nicole's absolutely right. We see major disparities across important groups in society in their level of trust overall and trust in particular institutions. And I think as we see now, this is changing. There needs to be much more work on interest, trust and confidence in the police and local communities, and tied with what the police and the elected officials are doing in those communities, so that we can understand better what's working, so we can build on that.
Thanks, Mike. I'm going to abuse my position as moderator to throw in my own little thought here, Ron, just in response to what you had brought up, about the, we want to show both sides of this and how climate change, is a place where that really has emerged as problematic. That, as someone who studies social media and online interaction and bad material online, it's been interesting to me to look at like comment sections, right? Which is like not a thing I advise in general, but I look at a lot of stuff online that I don't advise other people look at. And how some places have removed comment sections exactly for this kind of reason, right? So you look at like, I think Popular Science, one of these science magazines, dropped their comment section exactly because of this climate change issue. They're like, we're presenting the science, right? Like this is based solidly in good research, and the comment sections are full of people questioning it. And that ultimately makes the issue seem less settled than it actually is. And so we're not going to let people put their nonsense there in the comments, because even if we're just presenting the science side of it, which all says one thing, but if you let people say that, it's going to plant these little seeds like, maybe it's not as settled as it is. I haven't, because I am moderating and not a panelist, I haven't put together like how that really plays out in these kinds of issues. But I think that kind of conversation that we do see occurring under all sorts of both journalistic, scientific, solid media posts here, that kind of crazy conversation that happens online, it gives people who want to reject the truth-based elements something to grab onto because they find those communities. And I know that ties into points a lot of you have raised.
At 2:00, I'd be happy to be moderator, and you can be a panelist.
I feel like I get plenty of voice as panelists, so I'm happy to just moderate sometimes and chime in when I feel like it. So Michael, another point that had come up, and I think this was another one of those that flashed across the screen, it may have been in the Q&A. Someone said, what's the impact of like the Reagan years, where Reagan said government is a problem? Government's the problem, right? And how does that impact now trust in institutions for people who kind of, came up in that space? I remember that this is a thing that Reagan said, but I was not alive when that was happening, or barely, right? So, I feel like I'm on this sort of younger end of the spectrum where that may not be like the Reagan years definitely has not explicitly impacted my politics. But for people older than me, like, of course it has. And I wonder, Mike, I'm going to start with you, but I'll also throw this over to Ron. Like, do we see differences? Like, say, like Ron, you had separated out people, before, after 1980, kind of like separating out millennials and people older than that who kind of lived through and were conscious for the Reagan era, and what impact that has. So just like your general thoughts on that kind of like age difference and what those political experiences may have had. So Mike, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think that's absolutely the case. I think we've seen historically that the president guidance, and they have a tremendous platform to promote their ideas and shape the way we think about things and frame the debate. I think we see different generations. So, the issue with Reagan comes up. I mean, I've seen some people have written specifically about that claim, saying that, part of the change in distrust is out of that era, with Reagan, shaping the debate, and then also, the change to a more individualized lifestyle also plays a role. So I mean, there's lots of different factors, but I think that we see today that there are certain audiences that Trump has a hold of, where what he says matters tremendously. I think going back, this was before my time, but President Kennedy talking about the role of citizens in the government. I think he also created a lot of space for thinking about our role as citizens differently and what we can do. And someone who grew up in the 80s, I do have memories of Reagan being on TV and was exposed to those sorts of arguments. And I think we do see pretty big differences in attitudes about various policies and just in general in terms of what role government should play based on when you grew up and what you were exposed to during that era.
Ron or Nicole, do either of you want to chime in?
I would have my opinion, but I always like to say, show me the facts. And I wish we could go back and interview everyone in 1980 and survey them in terms of their perceived trust in government. But this is all really good in terms of our research project now, in terms of trying to detect how age and how experiences have evolved with the trust or lack thereof. So I don't.
Okay,
and I'll add it. I mean, I think, I was a little person when Reagan came out, but you also, and I think it goes back to what we've talked about in this conversation, presidential leadership actually it gives the compass for how people respond, right? We are actually contemporarily, we're seeing that now in this war on face masks, in terms of, the president not wearing one and how that's been politicized and racialized. But I think when Reagan was there, people often do not understand that Reagan said a lot of things from his pulpit, but he also did a lot of things. I mean, he cut social programs in communities of color. He was the first to declare the war on drugs, that militarized the police to actually battle at that time crack cocaine, which was disproportionately affecting African-American communities because they were more likely to be subjected to arrest. They were not likely to be the users, but they were more likely to be arrested. And so I think, we have to go back and look at the rhetoric that comes with, communications and from the top. And those communications, particularly of the Reagan years, I think really set a framework for coming in to, I think, these conversations on racial equity. I was just asked the other day, for example, when Lyndon B. Johnson actually put together the Kerner Commission, if that made a difference. And some of us can say, as researchers, that the Kerner Commission did not change the trajectory of systemic inequality, but it did put on the minds of people that we needed to do something, and that's something in my research I've been trying to, as a policy/researcher, get people to have conversations or commissions that sort of take us back towards a more forward-thinking approach to this versus, coming back with very, anti-mass, anti-leadership, just what we're experiencing now is sort of feeding into, I think, the debacle of citizenship and democracy in ways that is so, it's just so polarizing. And I just want to add too, Jen, I think what's different from Reagan that we actually have today are these platforms that have, in many respects, sort of allowed for this polarization to continue among certain groups. So we are all on these platforms, but I tell people it's like a playground. We're all on different equipment, but we're still all sitting on the same platform, playing with what we want to play with, or having affinities with the people we want to have affinity to, or the ideas and messages that reinforce our own values, even when they're supremacist or even when they're elitist. And I think that's the wild card that we actually have in the 21st century economy.
So we've just got a couple minutes left. I'm going to do my favorite thing that I do when I'm hosting on radio, which is I'm going to throw you I'm going to make a long question and then give you each a short amount of time to answer it. And Nicole, your last point really gets to that. And this ties into a question that someone had posted in the Q&A, which highlights that maybe every discussion is around power, right? So an interesting experience that I have as being in the iSchool, trained as a computer scientist, but playing in a social science space, is that I am on dissertation committees literally literally everywhere in the university. And I had the great privilege to be on one in American Studies, which I had never done before, which looks a lot at this issue of power. This student was primarily looking at Gamergate, which was a terrible misogynistic online thing. But he talked in his dissertation about how a lot of the dynamics that we see on social media are this reaction to power, because everyone is equally platformed on Twitter. You set up an account and you can share videos of what's happening to you. It gives a voice to all of these communities who were not reflected in those 3 channels that Ron showed us, right? If we go back into the 80s, the voices of Ferguson would not have been shown in the same way as in the 80s without Twitter as they were on Twitter. So social media, with all its problems, really gives a platform and it gives a voice, and it then gives power to people who didn't have it before. And that provides a lot of people with a way to challenge these institutions and ask if they're really trustworthy. So with that as sort of a setup to think about, so that power dynamic and the power that we're each given, I want you each to take 1 minute to give me kind of your closing thoughts on like that element. And if you have any like quick concluding either recommendations on reading or thoughts that you want people to have going forward. So there's a quick final thought, because I know a lot of us go in reverse order. Nicole, if you're ready to start, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's a hard question. I do think that despite the low barrier to entry, and I'll keep this short, the low barrier entry of the internet to various voices, like you said, that it's created movements like Black Lives Matter. I honestly think that the way that these platforms are constructed, they are still constructed in ways to maintain power systems. Because the nature, and I can talk because you're all scientists, the nature of algorithms and how they actually do search and rank still in many respects contribute to whose voices are louder on the echo chambers that exist on the internet. And the fact that what we're seeing now in the challenging of Section 230, for example, in terms of the Communications Act, these voices also get consumed by these broad scale debates, and they have the risk of being censored. So that's a long answer to a short, more complicated question, Jen. But I would say if you actually want to follow me, just follow me on Twitter at Dr. Turnerly. You can also follow me on the Brookings Expert page. But these are the issues that I deal with every day as a sociologist, for people who are wondering, who has an interest in tech and science as well as interdisciplinary work. So
thanks, Nicole.
Thank you.
Yeah, you and I should have a separate hour-long conversation about those algorithms, because we're going to have a lot to say. Mike, go ahead.
I'll try to be short. I agree with everything Nicole said. I would just add one little thing. I mean, these platforms are businesses, and that matters. That matters for how we think about this. And so it's absolutely the case that we have seen, more power be given to individuals and groups who can organize and use these tools. But at the end of the day, these are businesses seeking profit, and that plays as well.
Any follow or reading links you have?
I am not on social media. I'm scared of social media, and I think most of the time, besides my mom, most people don't really have an interest in what I have to say so regularly. So that's part of the reason why I have stayed off, but also because I am concerned about some of the pernicious things that can happen. And so I don't have anything to advertise on that front.
Okay, well, people can email you, and they can find you that on the University of Maryland website if they have questions. Thanks,
yes,
Mike.
I agree with both as well. I think I'd want to close by just saying I don't want to give the impression to anyone that the news should be just the facts, boring, without any outside voices, because there's a time and place for both, and they should definitely, for democracy, we need to have those voices. But the problem is, when 1980 came around and CNN was invented, so was CNN headline news. It only lasted 3 years because they could not fill enough information to keep the audience engaged. So the audience basically put them out of business. Now we have this other information, constant, and breaking news is what now, 8 hours old. It's just inherent now with all also the needs of the audience and what the audience expects, and like Mike says, profit. So I don't know what the answer will be, but I think that.
Thank you. So we are at the end of our time. I want to thank all of our panelists again for a really great discussion. Thanks to all of you who sent in a whole bunch of questions. And Ron, I saw you were sneaking in and answering questions, which is great. So thanks everyone for a really nice discussion. I hope whenever we come back and do this again, that there will be better sources of truth for us to rely on. And so our trust in whatever we place it in will be more justified. Thanks all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.